We're on to day 10, and this is a big one. This is the big one, at least in the context of Sophie's world, this is a big one. So let's take our in-depth look now into Hume and the empiricists. Now, Hume wasn't the first empiricist, right? You got that impression, I hope, correctly, that, as it were, it progresses more or less from Locke to actually Berkeley and then to Hume. Now, of course, they're like talking to each other through it too. It's not like it goes in a perfect straight line. For the sake of the story, the plot of the story, he does this. Needs Berkeley to be the climax before we move on from the empiricist, the whole point to empiricism, for bringing it up, at least in the context of the story. And for us, Hume is really more of sort of a culmination point, at least when we're moving toward this very, very epic, important time when Hume and Kant are in this, we're in this sphere with them of the Enlightenment period. They are the two philosophers who, to this day, you could probably become a die-hard Humean philosopher or a die-hard Kantian philosopher. You'll see why next time. And be taken completely seriously. But to be a die-hard anything else, to be a die-hard Berkeleyan or to be a hardcore, to be a complete dedicated philosopher to the philosophy of Leibniz, who I actually enjoy more than either of the other two to some extent. Kant, it's hard to beat Kant, I'll be honest. But in any case, that is less common. It's not, in fact, likely at all. You stand to be laughed at is the word on the streets. But let's focus on Hume. And the first thing we want to focus on Hume about is his empiricism, and we need to, therefore, think again about what this distinction is between rationalism and empiricism. Let's draw that line one more time because it's really important. This time of British empiricism is going to give way to all sorts of other things, but rationalism also never completely dies out. And if anything, rationalism survives strongly today in other places, often in philosophy, but not only in philosophy. I myself would qualify as a rationalist, certainly over an empiricist. So if you haven't gotten that impression yet, that's partly where my bias is going to lead towards representing these guys in certain ways. But let's talk about this empiricism. Now, we can think of it simply as empiricism, the belief that there is no source of knowledge other than sense experience. Of course, this is too extreme, and I like reading the notes that you guys take in your journal prompts and stuff and reflecting on the fact that this probably does look really extreme. On the one hand, you've got the rationalists, and they seem to be all about reason. Knowledge comes from reason. And on this side, you've got the empiricists, and everything comes through sense experience. That's where knowledge comes from. Maybe there should be some in-the-middle agreement there. Well, there's two things I need to say very quickly about that before we move on. One is we don't want to fall into another important fallacy. It's often just called the common ground fallacy or the middle way fallacy. There are different names for it. But what this fallacy looks like is that when you have two very different positions on something that seem like extreme ends, that you go with the argument, these are too extreme, therefore the middle is probably the correct solution. There's not necessarily any reason to buy into that argument based on that fallacy. Here's a case in point. I can go to one very far extreme of, let's say, in a religious matter and say God doesn't exist. I'm a complete atheist. And I can go to the other far extreme of God definitely exists. And we're talking about monotheistic God just to keep it simple and all that for right now. And if we went for this middle ground of, well, we don't know. It's not just agnosticism. I don't mean just the belief in God. I mean God as an existing being. Belief is one thing. Agnosticism is something we'll talk about more in a second in regards to Hume. But to make the claim that God kind of exists or sort of exists, that would be weird. That would be an incredible, that is an unlikely solution to the problem. So simply because you have two extremes doesn't mean that the middle ground is the best way to go. So be careful of that fallacy as you move forward. And don't think just because one thing represents an extreme and the other another extreme that it's too too extreme. We have to find the solution somewhere in the middle. Not that that won't often be the case, just that we can't rely on that being sometimes or often the case as a reason for that being a valid claim or solution to the problem. As it were in reality, here's the second thing, empiricists and rationalists are made to look like that's all they believed, when in fact, if you really read, and even in Gaarder's work, read what they believed, Locke was delving in some rationalism and some empiricism. Hume had believed very strongly in the need for sound ideas, right? And in order to first verify valid ideas, he needed reason in order to do that. It's not one or the other for these guys. So if you go about casting them and just one or the other, pigeonholing them, as it were, into one or the other category, you're going to miss out on a lot of really good philosophy and assume that you know better than they do, these brilliant thinkers. We all tend to want to think that way about people of the past, which we maybe could even call another sort of fallacy. Let's call it the historical character fallacy, where we think that because we live in the modern age that we must ultimately be smarter or more enlightened than the people of the past. Absolutely nothing guarantees that. In fact, just as a very small tangent, it turns out that recent studies have shown the brain size of Homo sapiens millions of years ago, about 2 million years ago, it is no smaller than the current brain size of modern humans. So if anybody tells you modern human is smarter than the early Homo sapiens of 2 million years ago, check them. It doesn't make sense. Now I'm going to use some very brief technical language here to get more at the heart of what this rationalism empiricism debate is about. Why specifically reason versus experience? And I mean, that's not a very hard line. There are lots of things that we reason about that is based on experience and vice versa. So why is this line being cast in the first place? And it's due to something that we can call the a priori a posteriori divide. A priori knowledge is knowledge of something that you have without any need for experience to have it. Going back to Plato for a moment, I've never experienced a perfect circle. I've seen some really close looking beautiful spheres and such, but never a perfect circle. And yet, a priori, we know what that means. A perfect circle is, by definition, you could say the infinite accumulation of points that are encircling, that are equal in distance to a center point or a focus or whatever you want to call it, the center of the circle, as it were. So they're all equidistant. If you were to take a point and infinitely connect those points with all other points, you would find that the locus of points all are equidistant to a center. That's a circle. I will never find that in reality. That's a priori knowledge. A posteriori is, as you can imagine, something that I can only know when I experience it in some form in the world. So here's one more example of a priori, and I'll contrast that to something a posteriori, and you can see what the difference is right away, I hope. So a priori, a bachelor is an unmarried man. I don't have to experience or research or know anything. I don't have to meet tons of bachelors. We don't have to take a statistical study of bachelors to find that they all are unmarried men. By definition, de facto, by definition, a bachelor is an unmarried man. That's a priori. However, how about we take the claim that all swans are white, right? With, a little black, but you know what I mean, majoritively white. So if all swans are white, how can I be sure of that? It's not by definition. By definition, a swan is not a white, beautiful goose-looking bird. I don't know what the actual definition would be. Obviously, it belongs in a taxonomy under other animals. But as it were, I would have to go about looking in the world, look statistically, look at past records, experience things, rely on something more than just what the definition is or how to get at the answer given the definition by way of experience or something like experience. And it turns out there are such things as black swans, right? Is the idea. So with that in mind, a priori versus a posteriori, which is going to help us understand Kant later on and what significant move he makes here between this debate between so-called rationalists and empiricists, but really it's just this tension between a priori and a posteriori. Well, we're going to see what Kant does later on with that. For now, we need to go back to Hume, because we can see these things in Hume. We can see how he's asking for both of these things, despite being the empiricist that he is. Then we have to figure out, well, then why is he called an empiricist? But he calls these over here matters of fact. Sorry, this one over here, matters of fact, the a posteriori. For example, the sun rises every morning. We see that over and over. We can take that in as a sort of a matter of fact. Now, don't get too confident about that, because that's precisely the sort of thing he's going to end up tearing down later on. He's going to tear down the empirical thing. Is that right? But then a priori is reason-based, right? And an example of that would be, again, sort of our 2 + 2 = 4 thing, or what is the definition of a triangle? Well, it has to have 3 sides, 3 corners, and that's it. And if it's in a Euclidean 2-dimensional plane, then the sides have to, the corners have to add up to 180 degrees, no matter what. That is a triangle, and that is what he calls a relation of ideas. That's the a priori piece, if you will. A relation of ideas. Anything that is not based in quantity or number, or does not have for it actual empirical evidence in the world, hence not things like miracles and such, which he completely bans from his repertoire, we need to cast to the flames. And then there are a couple of things that we need to get straight about that. So the problem, as it were, with matters of fact, how is this really that different from 2 + 2 = 4? Don't I have to just, can't I just come into the world and be told and understand that the sun always comes up? Well, no. It's just always come up to this point. And if your astronomy is pretty good, you might be aware of the fact that that wasn't always true. There wasn't always an Earth here. There wasn't even always a sun here. And there will be some point in the future, at least predicted by science, when the sun is going to turn into a red giant and engulf most of the inner planets in the solar system. And that won't take place anymore, this whole rising of the sun on Earth business. But even if you take all that predictive scientific stuff out of it, the point is that there's nothing by definition that says the sun has to rise. You could say the sun rises by definition, the sun coming up. But when we're saying the sun is a phenomenon rising over the, coming up over the horizon, there's nothing other than experience that informs us of that. And specifically, experience as habit. That is, we are in such the habit, not just our personal habits, like in the Aristotelian sense, but as a culture, as a society, as a civilization. For as long as we've had records, we've been watching the sun come up and watching the sun set. And that's something that we've just sort of taken to the bank for all of renowned history. And we assume, since prior to human history, that that's what's happened. Scientifically, it makes the most sense. It's still, though, something we can't completely prove. That is, we can't assume it to be the ultimate causal foundation for what happens in the world. And this is actually something really telling of science. Actual science, not the parts that are primarily based on mathematics, which of course is a priori and more of this relations of ideas business, but science cannot say for sure. Causality is a really tricky thing in science. You cannot say for certain that A causes B to happen. Not because you don't believe that to be true, but because that's not the sort of claim science can make. This is Hume's legacy. Hume says that while we continue to experience and see this experience over and over and over again, we continue to look in the petri dish and see the bacteria eating the sugar and increasing at certain rates that we then take down and statistically find a mean for and so forth, that we can't prove this is there's a cause for this, that it's the sugar that causes that the bacteria to grow, or that it is the even the earth turning that brings the sun up. Now, we can nonetheless, for all good extents and purposes, rely on those beliefs as a way of moving forward. He's not saying science is bollocks. He's saying we just have to take into account the fact that we don't have causal proofs, that causality is a tricky thing, and we rely too much on the habit of experience rather than something a priori or relations of ideas in order to come about understanding what's going on in the world. So those matters of fact are good. We want to keep those. If anything, again, that's what he's trying to purge. He's trying to hold on to these and purge anything that isn't one of these two matters of fact or relations of ideas. We just have to recognize the tricky nature of them. And there's one more really important thing, because Gaarder does not get into something that spurs so much recent philosophy. He can only cover so much, of course, but there are huge movements that happen in philosophy that really aren't touched on much by Gaarder, if at all. And two of them that I'll briefly bring up and then maybe talk more at length on at another time, if there's time, are phenomenology and logical positivism, which both are responding to British empiricism. And here's how it goes. Hume talks about experience. When I experience something, for instance, my little Daruma, I don't even know what to call it. He's a little ceramic Daruma doll, if you will. Super cute, by Marutani, apparently. Got him in Japan. Whole thing on Daruma, and this connects back to the Buddha, which we'll talk briefly about too. So this seems fairly relevant in some way. So Daruma or Daruma here. When I experience Daruma, right? How do I experience him? Well, he says that it's too easy for me to jump to the conclusion that there is an actual thing here in the sense that I perceive it. And he notices that as I turn around and I look at it from different angles, maybe I turn him around too and look at him with the light shining on different parts of him and so forth, and then maybe I turn off the lights, or maybe I put him in water, or any of these other things. I have these different perceptions of him, and there are different qualities to this little guy, and I perceive them in different ways over time. How do I get this? How do I get this idea of Daruma? In other words, we get this sort of like sense data version, which is actually a later idea, but it's pretty close, so let's go with that. Sense data. I get these qualities and I perceive them, and then I put them all together in my head somehow that there's a thing here, and that I'll call him Daruma, right? There's thing here, but it's just really a bundle of qualities is the idea. This is the empiricism. This is why we label him an empiricist over anything else. He's saying there's not so much a thing in its own right here, but a bundle, as it were, of qualities that I just sort of put together in my mind and come across as a thing. And that's not just Daruma, that's anything. At least any physical entity for sure. So the qualities that we experience around us, are all things that are really just qualities that aren't in our mind, we bundle together, and this bundle of qualities theory is what makes them so empiricist-based. This is what empirical data looks like, is you take into account what the senses are telling us, and then you bundle it together and make it meaningful. Now, the reactions to this are going to be strong later on, and one philosopher that we'll, again, hopefully have time to talk about sometime is Edmund Husserl, who says this is exactly the opposite of what is true in reality. Look, I don't come across a bunch of qualities why aren't they just floating around? They're adhering to something, aren't they? And if anything, I rarely notice the qualities first. If you've learned how to drive yet, if you're a driver right now, or maybe you ride a bicycle or whatever, you're not veering away from qualities. It's not simple, just like pure sense data of like, oh, there's a flash of brown, take a left so you don't hit that tree. No, you register there's something there, a tree, a pole, or something, and then you veer. You try not to hit it. So those like Husserl are going to say later on, phenomenologists is what they're called. Phenomenology is going to say later on, no, there's a thing here, and while I may not be able to say anything about that thing, which will be something Kant says more about later on too, I can't just go with qualities first because that's the easiest thing at my disposal. Actually, the very first thing that enters is something is here, and then I notice the qualities. Imagine in my peripheral vision, if I noticed something, I don't see white right now. I know there's something there, but I couldn't tell you exactly what color it is, despite the fact that I know what it is already. Couldn't tell you what it is per se until I really took a moment to look at it and noticed what its qualities were. So there's some pushback on this later on, and that's something Gaarder doesn't bring up. The logical positivists, on the other hand, this other important movement that comes about, they're going to say that anything that can't be essentially in some form, and this is an oversimplification, so please forgive me, but essentially matters of fact are the only thing we can really completely rely on. They're not saying relations of ideas are completely out of sorts, but unless we can empirically verify it in some form, it's out. So they take it to an even harder edge, to an even farther extreme. So British empiricist really is what clues in others to these movements, these new movements that take off in both the continental and analytic traditions. I will explain what those two things are at another time too, because they will become more relevant as we move closer to the modern age. So Hume is saying, okay, so there are these qualities, and then we have this, he calls it vulgar, this vulgar belief that there's the thing, and we have to operate in the world by way of this vulgar belief, this kind of commonsensical but otherwise not truly rigorous way of believing things in the world. And this brings us to something very similar, particularly the bundles of qualities bit, something to what indeed Gautama Buddha or Siddhartha Buddha, the first, so Siddhartha was the first person to be qualified or called a Buddha. In reality, for the record, there's supposedly an infinite number of Buddhas in Buddhist religion, in its own version of theology, religious Buddhism. You have an infinite string of Buddhas throughout the ages, and Siddhartha is just the one who gets claimed the first one in the records. In reality, there probably would be no Buddhism if it wasn't for this guy, this Indian prince who ended up going off and looking for enlightenment, or at least coming across enlightenment. And I will have to dedicate a whole nother course to Asian philosophy, including Chinese and other East Asian and South Asian, such as India. That is a whole nother bag of beans. But what Gaarder means to point out here in this bridging between Hume and the Buddha is indeed, if nothing else, particularly this idea of bundles of qualities and how that relates to the self, to oneself. Is there a self? Or is that something that we structure and make up? By putting together wings, which on a bird look really beautiful, and the idea of a person, babies in the case of cherubim, we get angels. So here are these complex ideas. Again, cast to the fire. We have no evidence of these things, says Hume. We have no evidence of these things, and resemblances are not enough. So these are neither matters of fact nor relations of ideas. Be gone with them. The self, then. I'm not going to take you through that whole analysis again, because Gaarder does a decent enough job of that in the book between the philosopher and Sophie. But this is what, too, the Buddha realizes as he moves through his enlightenment phase and starts to teach others, is that the self is part of a grand illusion that we continue to invest in, and that it is only in part by ridding ourselves of this idea of self that we can start to relieve ourselves of the suffering that we experience in life. That's point one. There's an interesting tie there between this old, ancient, 2500 BCE guy from India and this 17th, 18th century man in Scotland. However, one thing they don't share is this idea of miracles. Buddhism, if anything, seems to invest heavily in lots of miracles. It's a religion, after all. Hume is against this idea for the reasons we just stated. It's not matter of fact to have a miracle. He says basically what it is if you think that there's a miracle of something happening one time, then whatever so-called evidence even there could be of that miracle does not qualify it as a matter of fact. Because that one time, the evidence you have of the one time that incredible thing happened, someone going to a church and who was blind and supposedly able to see now, and such additional things, such evidence of that, weighed against the monumental amount of evidence of people remaining blind and not being able to see. You could say, if you were to put those on a scale, this outweighs this, which is very scientific when you think about it. Consensus through science is not just agreement, it's how much evidence weighs for one proposition versus another proposition. We take this into account too in law, in the courtroom. Does this one person's account of what happened really weigh against 100 other people's account of what happened? How do we weigh that? Is there more evidence? Or are all these people just biased against that one person? Is everyone else crazy and this one person is sane? Possibly, but unlikely. And for that reason, we can't commit to it. And in terms of religion, he does so much. He emphasizes how, in fact, we were so polytheistic before we were monotheistic. So the traditional narrative of Judaism and Christianity and even Islam, so the Abrahamic religions, the monotheistic religions especially, tend to emphasize that God was good, God made everything good, and there was the one God, but then people came in and with their, mischievousness, they came up with all these other false gods or loser gods. And it was never clear in those texts, by the way, if these gods are like actually existing or not, or if they're just figments of these people's imaginations. Regardless, that this is the evil doings of people. But Hume, correctly so, goes back in history and says, no, polytheistic religions appear to have always predated monotheistic religions. And he's not saying they're better for that reason. He's saying they're all nonsense. But we have to be much more thorough with how we even investigate the current workings of Christianity and in terms of its history, which is very controversial, as you can imagine at the time. A lot of these works, the main ones had to be published posthumously after his death. And now that brings us to his agnosticism. So agnosticism, which hopefully you feel familiar with at this point as well, is that the status of God as an existing being is unclear. That's the gist of it. So if you neither wish to commit yourself to the idea that God doesn't exist or that God does exist, you can be labeled an agnostic. There's a little problem with this category, though. It's the game I like to call the does God exist question game. So if you're asked, does God exist, then the answer you give to that, if it's a yes or a no, is playing the God game anyway, the God's existence game anyway. So either yes, he exists, or no, he or she doesn't exist. So either way, you have to sort of play into some version of theological debate about why they don't exist or why they do exist and so forth. Now, an agnostic is not a bad category, and it's probably where the majority of people these days, or intellectuals, tend to fall, if only because not everybody plays the God game. Not everybody necessarily asks that question. And if they do, then they still can default to that category because they don't necessarily fall into some version of argument that asserts for certain that God exists or that for certain he or she does not exist. So agnosticism is not that big a deal in the modern day for obvious reasons, I hope. What's kind of interesting is there's been a huge uprising of atheism specifically, which is, it tickles me a little bit because you could say on the one hand, I fall into that category in certain respects. At the same time, I think in other respects, probably more important respects, I would have to fall into the agnostic side. It's mainly that I think a lot of the theological presumption or the premises for theological claims of God are unfounded and mostly confounded in confusing language. Like, we don't just say, does God exist, but we often ask, is God real? So if you ask me, does God exist or is God real, I'd say, I want you to clarify what you mean by those two things because those are not synonymous to me. I won't go down that rabbit hole right now. But keep in mind that agnosticism, while maybe seems like this like sticking to the man sort of thing, or at least showing the Catholic Church whose boss I am, says Hume, not so much. It's more like he falls by default into that category, if only because he's unwilling to claim one or the other thing. There simply aren't relations of ideas or matters of fact that can go one way or the other on that matter. But he does push a lot for the idea that against the current of trying to prove God's existence, and helps formulate something that we have come to take for granted today, most of us anyway, that proving God's existence is an impossibility. Even were he or she to exist, that proving that would be an impossible feat. And now, finally, we can move on to Hume's ethics. So, as I was just saying, Hume's fork, which describes matters of fact and relations of ideas. Sometimes to sum that up, we just call it Hume's fork. And we don't want to confuse the two. In a very similar way, and there's a definite line between there, right? Between the a priori and the a posteriori. We have to draw that line there. Now, there's another definite line to be drawn when we get into Hume's ethics. And it's between what we call the is and the ought. Is and ought. The is-ought problem is how it's often called, but there's another name for it. A bit more graphic. Hume's guillotine. Nice, right? Okay, imagine that on either side of that blade is the is and the ought. What do I mean by that? The is recognizing matters of fact. So there are many hungry people in the world. Babies, there's still such a thing called infanticide, where babies are killed for reasons we don't find legit. There are still so many instances of littering and environmental damage done by plastic, despite the fact that we really need or use plastic and it's an extremely important invention. There are so many things that are. Then there's the ought, and this is possibly one of the most critical. If there's anything to really take away from Hume that to me stands against everything else that he said, it's recognizing that this ought of what we ought to do cannot per se necessarily, when we use the word necessarily in philosophy, we mean by necessity. By necessity or necessarily follow from an is. The guillotine blade comes down, cut. And what I say ought to be the case. We ought to create special, UN departments, if they're not already existing, that actively prevent the occurrence of infanticide. We need to vote for the candidate for office that is going to curb environmental damage to the greatest degree as per their platform, etc. We can't make that ought statement follow by necessity from the is statement. We can make an argument for it, and we can say that this is what I believe ought to happen, this is what I wish to see happen, but they don't come by way of logical necessity. It's that same distinction. The matter of fact and the relation of idea are entirely different animals. So is the nature of what is versus the nature of what ought to be. So what is it that determines what ought to be? Well, for Hume, it's the emotions. It's how we feel about those things. And there's a lot of legitimacy in this for me personally. I actually went into something called nonviolent communication for many years of my life and continue to use it from time to time today, which helps us acknowledge that often our feelings and emotions and so forth lead us to actions that we take or don't take, and sometimes result in these sort of moral imperatives that we feel inside of ourselves that can't, though, necessarily be inherent to the world. Now, I say that, but does that mean there is no such thing as an actual moral good and bad? This is the problem. And this is a problem that's worth, I'm not going to say much more on it. This is a problem that's worth delving into yourself. Is there an absolute good and bad the way that Socrates talked about it and Plato talked about it? Or is there only a relative really good or bad? Maybe this is a little bit more Aristotelian, or maybe this is Humean, in the sense that what we deem to be good or bad has a lot more to say about our emotions than about actual reason. I will mention one other thing. There's a great movement going on right now called rational compassion. And there are, it seems, a lot more people than we give credit to talk about empirical evidence, a lot more people than we tend to acknowledge in everyday speak, who actually make decisions not because they feel compelled to by way of emotion, but because they believe through rational investigation that it's the right thing to do, and that it would be the wrong thing to do to go against it. And we're so quick often to judge, well, they don't want to go against it because they'll feel bad. Well, maybe, but that still doesn't mean that they didn't arrive at that for the same reasons that we would do something for emotional reasons. Oh, I feel empathetic for X, Y, or Z. That could be a good thing. It could also be a bad thing. I could feel empathy for this one person, give them my resources, and fail to give those resources to something that would, to an organization or someone that could address the problem this person is experiencing in a wider scope and probably better than I could by doing it one at a time. Empathy can also be a problem as well. Now, I'm not saying that Hume claims empathy is the answer, but there is that little tinge in Gaarder's book that seems to give way to thinking that emotions and feelings are the answer to our moral dilemmas. So while we're here and talking about this, we need to address ethics. We've talked a lot about Hume's epistemology. We're broaching ethics. Let's talk about ethics. There are three main categories when it comes to ethical studies. If rationalism and empiricism are things that pertain primarily to epistemology, then let's talk about ethics at the wider scope. We have three particular branches. There's normative ethics, applied ethics, and meta-ethics. Now, we're only really, through the length of this course, talking about normative ethics. Applied ethics is where we, though, can take what we have decided or derived from normative ethics and apply it to real-life cases. So think of it like applied versus theoretical mathematics. Meta-ethics, though, which interests me a lot, is where we actually have to derive the criteria by which we understand normative ethics to come about. If you didn't get anything I just said in the last 5 seconds, don't worry about it. Here's our definition for normative ethics. A branch of ethics that works to establish moral standards that then determine right or wrong conduct. So a distinction I made earlier was prescriptive versus descriptive. Something is descriptive when I'm just describing it. That person is sitting in my seat. Prescriptive is when you actually go about trying to elicit behavior about that and say this is what should or shouldn't happen. This is what ought or ought not to do. So that was my seat. You should get out of it, please. That's prescriptive. Normative ethics is concerned primarily with the prescriptive end of things. What ought we to do in the case that X, Y, or Z is taking place? Meta-ethics, we could say, has a lot more attention given to descriptive language, so we're only going to focus on prescriptive stuff throughout this course. And so, bringing that back into the scope of Hume, Hume is saying we can't derive our prescriptive language for normative ethics from our metaphysical description of the world. We've spent a good deal of time on Hume. Let's address Berkeley. This is the pinnacle of the book, and I think this is really relevant to today, too. I hate to say it, but I do think we have some Berkeleyans out there. That sounds terrible, but and by the way, Berkeley is a great example philosopher to read up on and follow and struggle with and tackle. If you don't believe in this absolute idealism that he's about, then it's still worth taking the time. Don't dismiss it. Take the time to acknowledge how sophisticated actually and incredible this argument is. Let's get back to what that argument was, though. Do you remember Locke? The whole deal with Locke was, at least when it came to our epistemological understanding of the world, was that when we experience the world, we experience it by way of either primary qualities or secondary qualities. Now, the secondary qualities for Locke, just to rehearse this, are all the things that I experience subjectively. It's color, it's hues, it's lights, it's smells, it's tastes, etc. Primary qualities, then, are the things that are of themselves. That is shape, that is weight, that is motion, the things that we could objectively measure, right? And both Locke and we last time said that one thing about primary qualities is you never get the primary qualities on their own. There's no such thing as me seeing the shape and the weight and everything of the apple without the secondary qualities. Even if I got like a readout of what the weight is, I still have to rely on the secondary qualities of the numbers I'm looking at on the screen to be able to interpret primary qualities. This is where Berkeley is going to get it. He's going to get Locke, he's going to get others, and he attacks Locke specifically, actually. You'd think he'd be after the rationalists, but no, he's like, Locke, you didn't go far enough, buddy. This is how it's going to go. Take a look here. You've got the mind, fair enough, and you've got the thing, the object. The mind and the object cannot be bridged directly, is the idea. he's going to deny there is an object completely. But here's part of where he's going with this, why he says this whole thing is fallacious on Locke's part. That is, if the inherent qualities of a thing that comprise an object are weight and mass and all these other things, then the only way we ever come to relate to those objective primary qualities is by way of the secondary qualities. Its color, its smell, all those things. I have to rely on the resemblances, that is, the qualities, the secondary qualities. I have to rely on this imagery, as it were, in order to understand what the so-called primary qualities are. But that does away with any necessity for primary qualities. See, he's very much a man of parsimony, which is something that a lot of people use today too. This was the time of Occam, William Occam, and Occam's razor, which you may have heard before, that between two different theories, the one that is the simplest is more likely the correct one. That's also an oversimplification, yes. And we still sometimes rely on this, although you have to wonder, is there a necessity for parsimony between theories? Maybe not. Certainly the more you get into, particle physics and so forth, you realize there's some pretty darn nasty stuff in there. It is unlikely that the simplest explanation is necessarily the best one. But in any case, that is where Berkeley's going with this. By way of parsimony, he says there is no reason to even assume, to jump to the conclusion that there are primary objective qualities, because so-called secondary subjective qualities is all I ever experience. So, do away with one? I do away with both. You can't have a secondary and not a primary. There's no such, you can't have two when you never had one. So, that whole thing is gone. That model is gone. And for him, because the mind and the object are always separated, as it were, quote unquote, by this idea, but he's just given us the reason why we should even doubt that there's an object to begin with, then we need to just dispose of this model altogether. Let's just talk about what we experience, the ideas. He's still a mathematician. He's still saying reason and everything else goes. Again, empiricists were not saying only what you directly experience is what matters. He still uses reason. He had a huge bone to pick with the people who invented calculus, like Newton and Leibniz, and their ideas of infinitesimals, or infinity going inward. He said this is bollocks. But he is he's very much in the realm of reason, and makes these interesting claims that actually are pretty advanced, progressive, about optics and light. He does contribute some amazing stuff. He's not anti-science. He's not anti-math. But he's an absolute idealist. Solipsism is the doctrine that in principle existence means for me my existence and that of my mental states. Now, it's actually not fair to call Berkeley this completely, because Berkeley is still believing that I have a mind, but that my mind partakes in the mind of whatever connects everything together in order to keep it consistent. If there wasn't that consistency, right, then the world really would be just these monad-like disconnected units from one another that don't even experience one another, let alone seem to exist in like some sort of choreography like Leibniz says. So Berkeley is going to say that of course, connecting principle is the mind of God, or just straight up God. In other words, what Berkeley is really about here is not trying to disprove rationalism outright. He's really against, as it were, what's called representationalist materialism. So representationalism means that there are things and there is the representation of those things that I experience consciously through consciousness. And then materialism, of course, posits that the matter of things really exists out there and that it's all primarily material. There is an actual matter-based material Daruma, and I have a representation of him in my brain, or in my mind. Let me not use brain, because we talked about last time why that's not very accurate way of talking about it. I'll be more careful with language. I represent him in my mind, and this theory of mind and objects is what he's against. He thinks this is ludicrous. For one thing, this materialism is all getting up in the Kool-Aid regarding God and Christianity, because if it's a more and more materialistic universe, it's a less and less spiritual universe as well, as you can imagine. There are all sorts of reasons that he's against this, but one of them is definitely religiously incentivized here. And so both the materialism and the representationalism are thrown out the window with Berkeley. Now, I said that this is somewhat relevant to today. Part of it is solipsism itself. Solipsism is this thing that seems to creep back in occasionally. But it's really not a huge jump away from that sort of idealism or any sort of idealism into solipsism, where I can't prove that anything that's going on around me actually truly exists. We've almost all had this thought, by the way. I don't know about you. When I was a child, I had this thought before. I had the thought, too, of like, maybe everybody but me can see skeletons, can see each other, has like almost X-ray level vision, or can see some portion of the visible light spectrum that I can't. Now, I don't think humans can anymore, but it's great how that allowed me to exercise my mind a little bit and recognize that there are species in the world that can see other infrared and other types of light in the world, heat. It's really fascinating. But pushing that aside again for a second, it's not just as simple as that different people or different animal species can recognize and observe, or perceive, I should say, can experience these different ways of the world or different parts of the world, but that I really can prove that I, the thinking thing, the therefore I am, part of me, the essence of me, that I who is thinking is the only thing that exists. That is the only thing I can take for granted. That's what Descartes said too. This is the one thing I can be sure of everything else. I can go to that same Cartesian skeptic line of thinking and deny everything else exists. And unlike what Descartes did, maybe I am not convinced that I can build everything back on top of that again. And so this entire, experience that I have is illusory in the sense that it seems to indicate that there are things outside of me and there are other minds in the world, and there's only really, to be taken for granted, just me. That's solipsism. And it, again, is sometimes a slippery slope into solipsism if we go the way of absolute idealism. Not necessarily, but it can be. Perhaps even more pertinent than that, because I don't think most people will go down that route. But one route that a lot of people certainly have in philosophy itself is the anti-realist route. And we're going to introduce a whole bunch of other philosophers of the modern day another time. A lot of them will unfortunately be anti-realists in the sense that, and these are people that influenced me too long before I became a realist again, that basically are saying something along the same lines where, we can't say something about the world. And so we posit, we can't say that there is an external world or whatever. And so we just have to sort of bracket that and assume that there may not be. Or some people going down the more extreme end, to the extreme end of it, saying there's simply no reason to think that, and there's not one. This is anti-realism, and this is something that we can say has the same line, line of argumentation that Berkeley introduced, and can get us to that place very quickly. If Descartes was cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, Berkeley is way over here with this likewise very telling phrase, esse est percepi aut percepere. To exist is to perceive or to be perceived. That is it. That is what the world is. That is all I am. So after all of this, why would I still invest more in rationalism perhaps than the empiricist view? And it's partly because I am a realist. I do believe there are things out there. And I do actually believe it is possible for us to, not to directly access them, but to recognize our ability to find essential features of those things that we can't get directly from experience sometimes. I'll give you an example. Take a look here. I love optical illusions. They're just terrific. As you can see, we have these concentric pentagons, and then somebody did us the favor of making these oddly sort of distorted looking circular curves or lines in the middle, also in a concentric fashion. It's not a spiral or anything, just these odd circular shapes that are embedded between the pentagons. Now, as you can probably guess, I said this is an optical illusion. So what's wrong here? What are your senses telling you that maybe isn't quite right? Well, if I highlight those curves here, and then I take away the pentagons, hopefully you can see that those are indeed circles. They are completely circular. I'm not talking about any idealist Platonic circles here. I'm just talking about definitely something we would qualify as a circle, not a misshapen, mishappen, concentric, distortion of rings. Here it is again, just so you can be sure. Do you see them right over those lines? Take them away again. And it's easy for us now to fall right back into the pattern we had before. Except not quite, because reason now gives we have reason to evaluate this situation differently. I didn't have to highlight the circles in order to show them to you. Perhaps you can figure out other ways that rationalistically I could arrive at the same conclusion, that those are not distorted circles but circles proper. Perhaps I could simply take something like a measurement device. Again, it's rationalistic in the sense that we are going to not be able to perceive the circles as circles, but be able to deduce that they are circles from what we know about them. And if I were to measure all the way around any one of them, I should find that that measurement doesn't change. Remember how it's the locus of points, all equidistant from the center. And I could figure out, I could derive, therefore, that despite what my senses tell me, these are circles. So there is something about essences, perhaps, or at least something that is derivable from experiences of things that isn't directly contributing by way of sense impressions, but as it were, is something I can get at or derive through reason. Finally, the last thing I want to say is that while Gaarder has hinted at, has mentioned, actually he was kind of vehement about it through Sophie's words, the fact that there were women philosophers that don't get acknowledged, I can't help but notice that he mentions only one. At least, maybe there's more than one, and I can't even remember very well. He mentions, I think, maybe Hypatia, maybe Hildegard. Despite this, I am going to just mention a few of those very important women philosophers here. And unlike Gaarder, I don't feel that vehement about this matter. I do think that it is absolutely wrong, ethically wrong, that we would have at any point in history have filtered out the great grand works of women. But I want to make two quick points on that. The first point is that we didn't always do that. There were civilizations where women's scientific, mathematical, philosophical endeavors were embraced more readily. And I think we wouldn't even know such people as Hypatia if that weren't true. Secondly, it doesn't mean that that's what we're necessarily doing today. We're always going to be dealing with the echoes of past systemic prejudices, and the whole point of an echo is that it echoes. It continues on for some time. There's no purging of it per se, but we can always do our best to recalibrate ourselves and to make things better. But nonetheless, I'm going to mention these people because they really are worth noting, and the fact that Gaarder doesn't mention most of them, I think, is a little depressing, actually, despite the fact that he's ranted about it. So, the first here on the board is Diotima. And if you read the Symposium by Plato, you'll recognize that Diotima, Socrates says that, that's who this is supposed to be here, Socrates supposedly learned from Diotima the nature of love, of true love, and that love in this case has to do with something we mentioned before, the loving of beautiful things, but those are instantiated physical things at first, and then it becomes wisdom over time. So he may have even gotten some of his influence on his philosophy of wisdom itself from this possibly historical figure, Diotima. Farther in history, in Alexandria in Egypt, here's Hypatia, and you can see she's working on her skulls, and Hypatia is a Neoplatonist philosopher, but she's Neoplatonist at a time before Christianity has really set in. So you can see, though, if you look really carefully, I think, yeah, in this painting, if you look really carefully, you can see a Christian cross and some sort of it looks like a demonstration or a march. So the Christians are coming. And Christianity does eventually adopt Neoplatonism, but she's alive during a time when she's Neoplatonist but not Christian. And in fact, has reasons not to be, but nonetheless works as this sort of diplomat. A really terrific movie to watch, as I've mentioned, is Agora. So if you haven't seen that, there are some historical inconsistencies there, but really fantastic film. She's really great to know, and a mathematician and scientist on top of all else. Hildegard, too. Very, very mystic-based religious philosopher, 13th century, right? And we already get a pretty good description of her in Gaarder's book, so you can relate to that for more. I've always been kind of in love with the fact that she was an expert botanist. I would have loved to have taken classes from her on that. Moving past the ancient period and into the realm that we are today, and we won't go farther past this point right now because we'll have plenty of times to talk about other feminist philosophers and so forth leading up to the modern day. But here we have, to start things out, Émilie du Châtelet. And Madame du Châtelet is a French philosopher. She is also a mathematician, and she falls in love with the mechanics of Newton, and actually it sounds like may have contributed a lot after reading Newton's Principia, contributed to the notion, one of the notions of the law of conservation. So very important person there. There's a book that I've only started, and I love it so far, called Seduced by Logic. Émilie du Châtelet and Mary Somerville, who's another incredible, you could say, woman philosopher and mathematician, who I'm not going to talk about here, but worth looking up as well, by Robin Arianrod. Definitely check this one out if you get the chance. I'm enjoying this one very much so far. So, du Châtelet is during the 18th century. Now we have over here, around the 1600s, 1700s, this is Margaret Cavendish. And she is a philosopher, a poet, and kind of a spunky, she's sometimes called Mad Mag, or Mad Madge, I think it is. And she, in this wonderful, sarcastic way almost, says, you really don't need to mind my writings, you men out there who are denying us greater education and all this stuff. Because I just write this in order to pass the time, and you need only read this to pass the time and not take it seriously. It's terrific. But importantly, she does not say, like Gaarder would seem to indicate, that philosophers like her didn't go about just saying, okay, so reason is a man's thing, and we need to get out of reason and look more to emotions. Not at all. She's saying, judge my work by way of reason, not by what gender I am. Incredible, incredible stance to take, I think, during this time. Down below, this down here on the left-hand corner is Anne Conaway. To be clear, this is not the modern Anne Conaway of recent years in politics. This is Anne Conaway, who influenced, it would seem, Leibniz in his theories of his theory of the monadology. Her means of influencing Leibniz was a very rationalist one. So again, if you just equate rationalism with pure reason, and you're only invested in reason, and it's nothing about emotions and all that other, garbage, then it's really going to not make sense why some of these women philosophers were such diehard rationalists as well. And finally down here, probably the most well-known of them from this time period is Mary Wollstonecraft, whom I've also spoken of before. And she is really sort of our preliminary feminist at this time in history, makes some really important contributions to our understandings of perhaps why women would have been considered so inferior at times like this in history. Her argument, which is an argument that can be made in other similar matters today in other respects, not about women per se, but any so-called minority group, is that women were being denied education, and hence they were not as educated, and hence how could anyone verify the amount of intellectualism or what level of intelligence they could actually manifest. So she's saying, allow us education and let us prove how equivalently good we can be, perhaps, to you men who are putting us down for being inferior. That's it for today. We will next time be talking about Immanuel Kant And before we do, of course, questions and reflections, we will delve into a little bit more interesting material there too, so don't miss out on that. But next time, Kant. It's going to be a goodie. Meanwhile, married... No, that's... Sorry, cut that part. I don't know where I'm going with that.